So following the bones, we'll take a look at the muscular system, which basically is the system that moves the bones. We talked about in the skeletal system how it functions as basically a lever, sometimes a pulley system, but we're going to see that the muscles are really the ones that are moving those levers. So we already mentioned this before as well, the three types of muscular tissue. I just wanted to mention them here at the beginning to remind you that there's really three types of muscle tissue. We're going to focus in this lecture primarily on the voluntary striated muscle or skeletal muscle. We'll have a separate unit on the cardiovascular system, and we'll talk about some of the unique properties of cardiac muscle then, and we'll get more into it in physiology. Smooth muscle is the muscle of our organs, of our blood vessels, and so we won't spend a lot of time talking about them specifically, but we will encounter smooth muscle as we go through other organ systems. Like when we get to the GI system, it'll be smooth muscle there. When we get to the urinary system, it'll be smooth muscle there. So you can kind of think of smooth muscle as involuntary or organ type muscle. And you guys have already learned some of the unique properties of these three types of muscles previously. So all muscle tissue will have these four basic properties. One is excitability. That means it is able to receive an electrical signal or a chemical signal, which can, in a sense, activate it. And once it's activated, it will be able to contract. So that's the second property, is contractility. And this contractility of the muscle will create tension or generate force that can be used to move an object, perhaps. And then extensibility, that means it can change its length. It can get smaller, it can get longer, depending on the contractile elements. And then elasticity, meaning once it gets contracted or once it gets stretched, it needs to be able to return to its original length. And so all muscle tissue will have that type of elasticity. So in this unit, we're going to be talking about muscle tissue and the different muscles that we encounter, but I just want you to keep in mind that pretty much all of the four basic tissue types that we learned in the tissue chapter, epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue, nervous tissue, they are all to be found in and around muscle tissue. And so, for example, we'll see blood vessels as we go through, which would be epithelial cells. We'll see nerves as we go through, which would be nervous system. And of course, connective tissue is going to be what is surrounding the muscles, like fascia, for example, surrounding the muscle and keeping them in their compartments. So all of these four basic tissue types can be found in and around muscle tissue. The functions of skeletal muscle, I think some of them will be pretty self-explanatory. And some of them maybe you haven't thought of before. So I think skeletal movement, that's a function that everybody's pretty familiar with, helping you be able to walk, or while I'm talking here, I'm moving my hand back and forth because I can't help myself. When I talk, I move my hands. And so, even just moving my mouth and moving my hands as I give this lecture, that is all skeletal muscle that's doing that. Posture and body position. So we don't often think about our muscles of posture, but as you're sitting there in a chair, or as I'm sitting here in my chair, there are multiple muscles that are contracting just to keep me from toppling over. I have a infant at home, and she's now about 9 months, but it wasn't until 6 months that she could sit up on her own without support, because her postural muscles just weren't strong enough to support her weight. But as she grew, and as her nervous system develops and her muscular system developed, she's now able not only to sit up on her own, but she's able to crawl. She's able to kind of pull herself to a standing position, and pretty soon she'll be walking. All of those activities require skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle also supports soft tissue. We'll see this particularly in the abdominal cavity. If you'll just put your hand over your abdomen, you'll notice it's soft. There are no bones protecting your abdomen, and there are no bones kind of keeping your organs inside. What is keeping your organs inside largely are the muscles of the abdominal wall. They are holding your abdominal contents inside your body. And the same thing is true in the lower pelvis. If you think about down below your abdomen in the pubic area. So you've got your hip bone, you've got the pubic bone, the pubic symphysis, but if you kept going inferior and around your backside, there's no bones there. There's just that pelvic outlet, if you remember from the bone chapter. So what keeps all of your pelvic organs from falling out of the pelvic outlet? Well, it's several muscles that are there forming the floor of your pelvic cavity. So we don't often think about that, but muscle is also a support network, basically keeping things inside that need to remain inside. There are some muscles that will regulate the entrance or exit of materials. If you think about, we're going to learn about the orbicularis oris, for example, around the mouth that kind of helps you pucker your lips, and other muscles that kind of open and close the mouth. So those muscles help keep things out that shouldn't come in. For example, if I want to feed my little baby a spoonful of peas, she may close her mouth shut and prevent those peas from entering her mouth. And at the same time, you have sphincter muscles that are regulating urine output and stool output in order to let waste materials out. So they also regulate entrance and exit of materials. And then one I think that we don't think a lot about is shivering. So if you've ever been outside on a cold day and you've been out too long and you start to shiver, that's muscle contraction, and the purpose of that muscle contraction is not skeletal movement or posture and body position or supporting soft tissues. It's to make you warm. A byproduct of muscle contraction is heat. And so by shivering, by contracting your muscles rapidly, you can produce quite a bit of heat and warm up your body. So that is another one of the roles or functions of skeletal muscle. Okay, I wanted to look at the anatomy of muscles, and I wanted to go kind of from big down to small. We'll spend a fair amount of this lecture talking about the smaller components of muscles, the microscopic components, and then we will spend the rest of the unit basically looking at the larger components, the actual muscles themselves. So, but if we start with a muscle, let's say in this case we're looking at, it looks like a muscle in the forearm, maybe brachioradialis. And so you can look at the muscle as a whole, and those muscles, if you look at a whole muscle, the whole muscle is really composed of bundles of muscle fascicles. So if you look here at this top picture, you can see that there are multiple muscle fascicles or bundles of muscle within that one big muscle. Now, if you took one of these fascicles out and looked at it more closely, you could look at its composition and see that even a muscle fascicle, which is a small part of a whole muscle, is itself made up of even smaller parts. And those smaller parts we would call muscle fibers. So you can see in here there are multiple muscle fibers that are making up the muscle fascicle. And muscle fibers are really just another way of saying muscle cells. But because muscle cells are not like other cells in our bodies, for example, they're multinucleated, they're also very long, elongated type cells, very large. That's why we call them muscle fibers, but technically muscle fibers are really just muscle cells. Okay, but let's say we pull one of these muscle fibers out and we take a look at it even more closely. You can see that that muscle fiber is actually composed of even smaller units, and we would call those smaller units myofibrils. And so you can see all these little red circles. These are all myofibrils, which are inside the muscle cell. And we're going to take a look at the muscle, we're going to take a look at the myofibrils here in a minute and even break them down into smaller components. And we're going to start by looking at myofilaments. These are the individual proteins that string together to make the myofibrils. And we'll spend a bit of time looking at them because they're really the unit of contraction. They're actually what cause muscles to contract. So anyway, I just want you to get a picture of this kind of way that muscles are grouped together, all the way from microscopic subcellular groupings all the way up to larger groupings. So if we look again back up at the larger tissue, and we saw that whole muscle here, and we said that whole muscle had smaller units to it, the muscle fascicle. You can see that the muscle fascicles are separated by a type of connective tissue. And so remember I told you at the beginning that within muscle we have several types of other tissue, including connective tissue. So we're going to look at 3 mesiums, M-Y-S-I-U-M. You can see there's an epimesium, a paramesium, and an endomesium. So the 3 mesiums are just connective tissues that surround different parts of the muscle. So an epimesium is going to surround the entire muscle. So if we blew this up, for example, you would see the epimesium is the connective tissue that kind of surrounds the whole muscle. So epi means above, if you remember, so this would be kind of above the muscle, or kind of outside of the muscle fibers. Then we have perimesium. Peri means to surround, and so the perimesium is going to surround each of the individual muscle fascicles. So again, if we kind of blow up our picture here, you can kind of see that each of these fascicles is surrounded by a ring of connective tissue. That would be the perimesium. Or this picture here kind of pulls one of those fascicles out and shows how the perimesium completely surrounds that muscle fascicle. Now within the fascicle you have individual fibers, right? We were talking about that's an even smaller unit. And so in between the muscle fibers you have more connective tissue. And we're going to call that the endomesium. If you remember, endo means inside. So that's going to be at the most inside layer you're going to see the endomesium, actually surrounding individual muscle cells, muscle fibers. And that's going to be where a lot of the capillaries are, the blood supply for the muscle. Muscle requires quite a bit of blood supply in order to bring oxygen and other nutrients that are needed to make ATP, which is how the muscle contracts. So eventually you want to get to the muscle as a whole, and so part of the way that the organization of the muscle from that smaller, even microscopic level is for all of these mesiums, all of these connective tissue surroundings will come together and eventually form a tendon. And we talked about how the tendon was a type of connective tissue proper that connected the muscle to the bone. And so now we can kind of see at a smaller level, or a building block level, that those tendons are composed of epimesium, perimesium, endomesium, all coming together. Aponeuroses would also be formed in the same way. Those are those kind of broad, flatter types of connective tissue that also, often they're connecting one muscle to another muscle, things like that. Yeah, and then I think we mentioned already previously that the tendon actually weaves itself right into the periosteum so that it becomes very tightly connected to the bone. We saw that in the connective tissue lecture. Okay, so if we look at muscle tissue, and we just talked about some of the connective tissue that you will find within muscle tissue. Well, there's also nervous tissue that's intimately involved with muscle tissue. So because we're talking about skeletal muscle, that's the type of muscle that is voluntary, meaning it requires conscious neurological activation, so to speak. And so you have to think, I want to move that muscle, or you have to think, I want to sit up, or you have to think, I want to walk. And what happens is you get a message that eventually comes from the brain and down the spinal cord, and from the spinal cord goes out to the individual muscles. And so those nerves that are coming from the spinal cord out to the muscle to signal the muscle to contract, we call those motor neurons. And more specifically, the ones that we're talking about are alpha motor neurons. So those alpha motor neurons will come from the spinal cord and will signal a muscle to contract. So there's an area, if we kind of blow this up so you can kind of see, there's the motor neuron that would be coming out of the spinal cord, and you have an electrical signal coming down that motor neuron, And that neuron synapses here with what's called the motor end plate. It's the part of the muscle that abuts very closely to that motor neuron, to the end of that motor neuron. And if we kind of blow that up, so this picture is kind of a blow up of that area that we call the neuromuscular junction. So that word just means neuro, meaning nerve, and muscular, and the junction between the two. So that's, you know, kind of this whole area that I outlined here. That's the neuromuscular junction. So if we blow up the neuromuscular junction, we can see the neuron component, and we can see the muscle component. And this area in between we will call a synapse, and we'll see that in the nervous system as well. The space in between two neurons we will also call a synapse. And what happens here in the synapse, when that electrical signal makes it to the muscle, it causes the release of chemicals called neurotransmitters, and the primary one is acetylcholine. You don't have to memorize that yet, but you'll need to know that later. So acetylcholine is then released into the synapse, and that acetylcholine binds to channels that allow the signal to pass from the nerve to the muscle. And that influx of charge basically becomes the signal for the muscle to contract. And when you take physiology, we'll go into great detail on how that signal is produced. But for here in anatomy, I just want you to understand the different components of the neuromuscular junction. So we have an alpha motor neuron, we have neurotransmitters, we have the synaptic cleft. I kept calling it the synapse. That's fine. That's another name for it. And they eventually land on the motor end plate, which is this part of the muscle. This is just showing you real pictures. Of course, they've been colored to help you see. But as you can see, this is a scanning electron microscope at 400 times magnification. And you can kind of see the motor neuron coming, and then you can see the neuromuscular junction there, and then you can kind of imagine what's going on in between the end of that nerve and the beginning of that muscle in the synaptic cleft. All right, I did mention that most of this lecture was going to be kind of looking down deep down at the kind of smaller microscopic level and even subcellular level. And that's kind of what we'll get into now, is looking at, if you took a muscle fiber, a muscle cell, and you looked inside that muscle cell, you would find those myofibrils. And if you looked at the myofibrils, you would see an organization of myofibrils that actually produce the contraction of the muscle. And that's what we're going to kind of get into for most of the rest of this part of the lecture. So to do that, though, we have to kind of understand the anatomy of a myofibril. We have to understand the terminology is a little bit different for a muscle cell than it is for most of the other cells of the body. And so we want to take a look at a muscle fiber, muscle cell, and look at the names of some of the anatomy there. Then we'll look down at the myofibrils. So we learned about the plasma membrane back in the cellular anatomy chapter, if you remember, that phospholipid bilayer that surrounds most cells, pretty much all cells. Well, when we talk about that same barrier, that same membrane which surrounds muscle cells, we give it a different name. We call it the sarcolemma. So instead of calling it the plasma membrane, we call it the sarcolemma. What's interesting about the sarcolemma is that it doesn't just surround kind of the outside of the cell, but it actually sends off kind of like little passageways that go down deep into the cell. And that's important because they're going to need to deliver the electrical signal that's coming from the motor neuron. That electrical signal is going to have to be transmitted all over the muscle at roughly the same time in order to allow for complete muscle contraction. And so you need that membrane to kind of produce a railway. You can see here going down deeper into the cell to reach the deeper functional units, the deeper myofibrils. All right, there's also a cytoplasm in this muscle cell, just like it is everywhere else, and we call that, instead of calling it cytoplasm, we call it sarcoplasm. Muscle fibers also have endoplasmic reticulum that is very specialized and stores calcium. And so we give it a different name, sarcoplasmic reticulum. So you're starting to see a theme here, right? This sarcolemma, sarcoplasma, sarcoplasmic reticulum. So that's going to give you a hint that we're talking about the muscle when you see that word sarco. Remember that they're multinucleated, they're long cells, and they're filled with myofibrils. We've already discussed that. All right, so if we look at how, how a muscle fiber is formed and how did it get to be so long and have so many nuclei, we can look developmentally and see that developmentally you had individual myoblasts, or immature muscle cells that were trying to form muscle cells, and they eventually come together and they fuse together and lose their individual properties, and they begin to fuse together and become one cell. And as they fuse together, they keep their nuclei, so you get many nuclei, and of course they add their contents together, so you end up with very large elongated cells, much longer than a typical cell. Then those muscle cells are then, well, you can see the picture here, they can be very long, we talked about. They are composed of, inside, those myofibrils. So you can see even more, all these little red dots, those are the kind of long tubes of protein that are strung together and actually cause the contraction of the muscle. So as we pull those myofibrils and myofilaments out, we'll begin to see how they work together to form muscle contraction. So remember, myofibrils are composed of myofilaments. Myofilaments are just proteins that are stuck together to form strands. And we've already learned about these when we were talking about, I think it was when we were doing the cellular anatomy. We talked about thick and thin filaments. So these are the myofilaments. You're going to see this prefix myo. That's going to mean muscle. You're going to see that over and over again. So myofilaments are just filaments, which mean long strands of protein that are found in muscle. And we talked about two different types. We talked about several types, but the two that show up here in muscle are the thin filaments and the thick filaments, if you remember that. And the thick filaments were formed with myosin, and the thin filaments were formed with actin. And so those are the two filaments that we're really going to talk about here. And what we're going to find is that the thick filaments, the myoglobin, those are the filaments that actually are stationary. They don't actually move. They don't do any contracting or sliding. It's actually the thin filaments that do the sliding, those filaments that are formed from actin. And so if we took a group of myosin and a group of actin, and we pulled them out as a functional unit, we would give that unit a name, which we call the sarcomere. So remember, we were using that word sarco was telling us that it was a component of a muscle cell. So this is the sarcomere, is the functional unit for muscle contraction. This is where you're actually getting shortening and lengthening of the muscle fiber in order to cause tension and movement. Now you can see in this picture that the sarcomere is composed of several distinct areas, and some of them are very easy to see, and some of them take a little bit more imagination. So if we look here at the M line right in the middle of a sarcomere, that's this purple line here. And what that is an area of the sarcomere that holds adjacent thick filaments together. So you can see that this thick filament and this thick filament, they come together here at the M line. So that M line kind of acts as an anchor for those thick filaments. And you can see spreading out on each side. Well, analogous to that would be what we call the Z line, and that's an area in here that holds adjacent thin filaments together. So it becomes the anchor for the thin filaments. Now there's something called the H-band, and I'll mention it here because this picture is less confusing than the ones we'll see coming up. The H-band, you can kind of see, is an area where there are only myoglobin or thick filaments, right? You don't see any of the red thin filaments in this whole area. So that's going to be called the H-band. And if you looked under a microscope, it would look more white. It would, because there's less filaments there, there's less proteins there. It looks less congested, it looks lighter in color. So it's the area where there are only thick filaments or, yeah, well, here you can see on the purple line. If you look, for example, right next to it, you can see that this has red and purple, red and purple, red and purple. So that's not the H-band. The H-band has only the purple lines, which represent the thick filaments. Okay, well, let's look at the next picture. We're going to kind of take this sarcomere, we're going to keep looking at it, and we're going to add a few more sections to the sarcomere as we go along. Okay, so if we look here, we can see a few more sections. So we have that H-band that I mentioned. That's this part in the middle where there are no actin filaments. We have our Z line and we have our M line, so no difference there. But now we're going to add a few different bands. So there's an I band, and that's going to be where there are actin filaments, but there are no myosin filaments. So you can see that's going to be from here, and it would go all the way around to the other side, to the next sarcomere. And you can see it's also here on this side, and it would go over to the next sarcomere if we had a picture there. Okay, so the I band is analogous to the H band. And then we have one last band, which is going to be the area of kind of the entire area taken up by the thick filaments. So from the end of one thick filament all the way to the end of another thick filament, that's the A band. And why these are important is because they help us understand what's happening during muscle contraction. So if you look at the resting sarcomere, which is this one here on the left, and we've got a muscle that's at rest, so it's not contracting. Notice how big the H-band is, right? That's from here to here. That's the area where there is no overlap of actin on myosin, where you are getting only thick filaments and no thin filaments. So that's at rest, and that's when the muscle's longer. But look here at the contracted sarcomere, and look at how small the H-band has become. And by seeing that, what we know is that it wasn't the things that haven't changed. The A-band hasn't changed. The M-line hasn't changed. All the things that pertain to the myoglobin have not changed except for the H-band. And that tells us that it's not the myosin fibers that are moving or sliding. They're the ones that are stationary. The ones that are sliding are these actin filaments. They are sliding in towards the M-line, and that is causing a shortening of this H-band. And when people first were studying muscles, that's what they saw. They saw that contracted muscles had a smaller H-band and resting muscles had a larger, longer H-band. And that's how they discovered that it's the actin thin filaments that are actually doing the sliding. So here's another picture. This is showing you contracted muscle. Look at how small that H-band is. And I like this picture just because it shows you what it looks like under a real microscope, and you can actually see these bands. You can see the M line right there in the middle. You can see the Z line on either side, right? You can see the I band is this area on either side of the Z line where there are no darker myosin thick filaments. And then this very kind of tiny H-band in the contracted muscle. Okay, so there's a couple of terms involved with muscle that I thought would be useful to you to understand. One is hypertrophy and the other is atrophy. So you can see they both have the trophy at the end. One is hyper. Hyper always means, right, bigger, more, And so hypertrophy is going to be enlargement, a bigger than normal muscle. This happens, for example, if you lift weights. When you work out and you're trying to build muscle, what you're actually doing is causing hypertrophy of the muscle by repetitive motion, repetitive contraction of that muscle. And so what happens is you get an increase in myofibrils as well as mitochondria, which are needed to provide energy for all of those new myofibrils, and an increase in glycogen, which is a kind of a glucose storage molecule, which will help feed the mitochondria in order to make ATP. Since you have more muscle, you need more energy, and in order to make that energy, you need more glucose. So you end up storing more glycogen. And so the increase of myofibrils, mitochondria, and glycogen actually make the muscle larger, and you can see that, right? If you've been working out for 6 months and you take a picture before and after, you'll be able to visibly see that the muscle is larger. That is hypertrophy. Atrophy is the opposite. Atrophy, whenever you see that A, it usually means it's a negative. So that's negative trophy. Trophy is kind of like a word for growth, trophic. And so hypertrophy will be increased growth, and atrophy will be reduced growth or no growth or negative growth. And so in this case, atrophy occurs when you don't use something. So I'll give you an example. I just told you about my wife and how she broke her radius a month ago, and she just got her cast taken off. And I mean, you can visibly see if she holds her right forearm and her left forearm together, you can visibly see that the left one is smaller because the muscles have shrunk, they have atrophied. And if that occurs too long, if she doesn't go to therapy, if she was in a cast for 6 months or 12 months or 2 years, she may actually lose function completely. And so we want to get those muscles moving and strengthened again as soon as possible after injury or surgery. Muscle can also be separated into how quickly it contracts, or another way of thinking of it is how quickly it fatigues, and maybe what types of movement it's used for. And so there's actually 3 types: fast, slow, and intermediate. I don't have a column here for intermediate just because it's in between, what we would see for fast and slow. So fast fibers mean they twitch more quickly, so the message gets from the brain and results in muscle contraction more quickly. And this is used for fine movements. Think of a pianist playing, a Beethoven or something. They need to move their fingers quite rapidly. Another example would be your eyes following traffic. If you were just kind of sitting out on the benches near the fountain in front of the college there and watching the traffic go back and forth, your eyes move back and forth very quickly. A bird flies into view and your eyes look up at it. You see a squirrel over to the right and your eyes look at it very quickly. Those are fast twitch fibers. So they're good for things that require fine-tuning, very quick movements. The downside of them is that they fatigue very quickly. We'll talk about this a little bit more when we do physiology together, but anaerobic respiration has a limited amount of energy, a limited amount of ATP, and because that's the type of metabolism that they use, they're not able to sustain their movements for very long, and so you will eventually get tired out. In fact, one of the first signs or symptoms of a disease called myasthenia gravis, which is a problem at the neuromuscular junction, is seeing double vision, and that's because those eye muscles are not able to keep up because there's a problem at the neuromuscular junction, and so you end up seeing double. Sometimes fast fibers are also called white. So for example, when you order white meat at KFC and you get a chicken breast and a chicken wing, right, that's the part that the chicken was using to flap its wings very quickly. That's white meat, and it's whiter in color because it contains less myoglobin. Myoglobin is kind of like hemoglobin in the blood, but in the muscle, and it helps carry oxygen. And because fast fibers don't really use very much oxygen, They don't need as much myoglobin, and so they're lighter in color. We call that white muscle. So slow fibers you're going to see are basically the opposite. They take a little bit longer for the signal to get from spinal cord to actual contraction, but they fatigue less quickly. They're able to contract and hold their tension for longer periods. For these, think of your postural muscles. Think of the muscles of your back that are holding you up right now as you sit and listen to this lecture. Unless, of course, you're laying down in a bed, and then even your postural muscles are relaxing. But these are bigger muscles. Some of the muscles that help you stand in your hip, for example, or help you walk longer distances. Some of those are slower fibers. And the truth is that a lot of muscles have a variety of fast, slow, and intermediate fibers mixed together because each muscle may have different functions. Maybe sometimes it needs sustained contraction, and so it's going to rely heavily on the slow muscle fibers, but maybe it will need a shorter burst of quick contraction, and it will need to rely on some of its fast fibers. So often an individual muscle, like a biceps, for example, will have different types of muscle fibers within it, although one will typically be predominant. Okay, so in addition to taking longer to contract, fatiguing less quickly, these use aerobic respiration. Aerobic means they use oxygen, and because they use oxygen, they're able to make more ATP, which is why they're able to last longer before they get fatigued. But they're also then darker, red, sometimes we call it red muscle, because myoglobin is kind of a red protein, and there's a lot more myoglobin in slow fibers because the myoglobin carries oxygen, and slow fibers use oxygen to make their energy, their ATP. So it changes the color of the fiber. And that would be what you call dark meat. So that's like the thighs and the legs of the chicken, because those are postural muscles. Those are helping the chicken stand up all day. But chickens don't do a whole lot of flying, but they do flap their wings from time to time, and that requires the white meat of the chest. All right, so here's just some pictures to show you. The ones here on the left are showing you what it would look like under a microscope, and the one over here is showing you what it would look, under like a stained under a light microscope, and the one on the right is more under an electron microscope. But you can see, especially in the electron microscope, that this just looks darker, right? I mean, this band of muscle here, that looks darker than the one below it. And so this is an example of fast fibers that's coming from your eyes. This is an example of slow fibers coming from some of the postural muscles of your legs. And you can see that the colors actually look different. We can also talk about muscles in terms of how they're oriented, or another way of thinking about that is how or what direction they're moving on the body. Are they moving in only one direction? Do they kind of branch out and move in multiple directions? Are they moving straight up and down, or are they moving kind of at an oblique angle? So we can give all of these orientations its own name. And by looking at the orientation of a muscle, you can often determine the function of that muscle. What direction is it going to pull the shoulder or the leg or the elbow or the knee or the hip by looking at the orientation of the muscle fibers. So following that orientation helps you see the direction of force that's generated by contraction of those muscle fibers. So a lot of the muscles in our body are what we would call parallel. That means they kind of run straight up and down or straight side to side depending on where they are. But there's not a lot of variation in the angle of the muscle. It's pretty much along the long axis of that part of the body. And so we would call that parallel. Examples here are like your biceps brachii, which is the biceps muscle in your upper arm that everybody knows about, or your rectus abdominis. Those are kind of what gives you your six-pack or your eight-pack, our rectus abdominis muscles, and they run up and down along the longitudinal axis of the trunk in parallel form. Then we have something called convergent muscles. These are muscles that kind of fan out. Convergent means they all the fans come together at the tendon. You can see there. So they all converge on one point, but they kind of fan out from that one point. And a good example of that is your pectoralis muscle, your pecs, right on your chest. that you kind of work out when you do push-ups or you do bench presses. And these produce less tension than parallel fibers do, which are very strong and can produce a lot of tension because all the fibers are running in the same direction. So convergent muscles can't produce quite as much tension as a parallel muscle, but it's able to produce movement in multiple directions depending on which fibers are being contracted. So, for example, if this is the shoulder and there's the humerus, if you contract these, you're going to pull the humerus in that direction, whereas if you contract these, you're going to kind of pull it up as if you were kind of shrugging your shoulders. And so by activating different parts of the muscle, you can actually have various directions of movement, and that's kind of the benefit of having some convergent muscles. There's also pennate muscles, and these are a little bit like convergent, except it's more like it's on either only coming from one side or coming from opposite sides. So you can see the examples here. Basically, the point is that they leave the tendon at an angle, and maybe that angle goes in only one direction and it would be unipennate, or maybe that goes in multiple directions or both directions, it would be bipennate. Or maybe you have one that goes in multiple directions and you would call that multipennate. The deltoid is the example there. So same idea there, not quite as much strength as a parallel muscle bundle, but would allow for movement in multiple directions. And then circular muscles, a lot of times we call these sphincters, and they control a lot of the openings to the body. So the urethra, where urine comes out, is controlled by two sphincters. Your anus is controlled by two sphincters to kind of control the flow of stool out. Your mouth is controlled by sphincters. The junction between your stomach and your small intestine has a sphincter. Your esophagus has two sphincters. So you'll see multiple sphincter muscles or circular muscles. And what happens with a circular muscle is that what's unique about them is when they contract, they make the orifice that they're surrounding smaller through contraction. And in some cases, they even close completely that orifice, that opening, by contracting. And that makes them very unique. And of course, when they relax and open, then that opens the orifice and allows things to pass through. When we talk about any muscle, really pretty much all muscles are connecting two bones together in order to move one bone against another, or to move two bones along a joint line. For the most part, some are within one bone, but for the most part, you're trying to move one bone against another. That's the function of muscles. And so we call, so the muscle is going to attach on two ends, right? It's going to attach from the bone it came from, and it's going to move toward the bone that it wants to move. And so we give names to those two different points of insertion. The origin is going to be the part of the muscle that's the end of the muscle that's attached to the bone that's remaining stationary. So let's say we're talking about your biceps muscle, and that's going to be largely in your upper arm, right? But the tendon actually inserts down on the ulna in order to move your elbow joint. But the humerus bone is the bone that remains stationary. It's actually the ulna that moves at the elbow joint. So we would call the insertion point on the ulna, we would call that the insertion. But the place where it inserts on the humerus, we would call that the origin, or the beginning of the muscle. So every muscle that you learn is going to have an origin and an insertion. And I don't typically make you guys remember or memorize for the exam the origin and the insertion of each muscle. But what you'll find is it's really helpful to understand the type of motion that contraction of that muscle produces by understanding where is the origin of that muscle and where is the insertion of that muscle. When you know those things, you can predict the direction that bone or joint will move when that muscle is contracted. So it's the insertion part that should move. That's the end of the tendon that should be moving. If you have, the origin then we talked about should be proximal to the insertion. So if you're not sure which end of the muscle is the origin and which end is the insertion, a general rule would be that the part of the muscle that's more proximal is going to be the origin, and so the part that's more distal is going to be the insertion. If one end of the muscle has an aponeurosis and the other end has a tendon, the aponeurosis is usually the origin end. And if there's multiple tendons on one end, that's also usually the origin of those muscles. So these are some general kind of tools to help you determine where's the beginning of the muscle, where's the end, where's the origin, where's the insertion. And that will help you know how that muscle is going to move those bones or joints. We can also talk about muscles in relationship to other muscles that move the same bone or the same joint, because sometimes the muscles are working together to produce the same movement, and we would call those synergists, for example, if more than one muscle is working together to produce the same movement. But sometimes you have muscles that are moving in opposite directions. And so a good example, again, would be your upper arm. And you all know about your biceps muscle. That's kind of the big Popeye muscle on the top of your upper arm. And on the back side of your arm, you have what's called the triceps muscle. And those two muscles have the opposite movement at the elbow. So the biceps, when it contracts, it causes flexion of the elbow. And when the triceps contracts, it causes extension of the elbow, opposite movement of the elbow joint. So we would call those muscles antagonists because they oppose each other. An agonist muscle we would give to basically the muscle that's the primary mover. So, for example, in flexing your elbow, there are a few muscles that do that. Brachioradialis, for example, biceps brachii, and even a couple of other smaller muscles are involved to one degree or another of flexion of the elbow. But because the biceps brachii is the largest, strongest muscle that runs parallel to that joint, it becomes the primary mover. And because it's the primary mover, we give it the name agonist. And then fixator, we don't have to worry too much about. You can probably put an X through that one. So just remember the other three there. All right, the next few slides just give some muscle terminology. These are terms that you're going to see used in muscles all the time. For example, you've heard me use the term biceps. Bi means two, ceps means belly, so it's a muscle that has two bellies. And there's actually more than one biceps, so in order to talk about the one that's in the arm, we say biceps brachii, because you remember brachium or brachial referred to the upper arm. So if I say biceps brachii, that means it's the two-bellied muscle that's in the upper arm. So these are some of the other words that will help you understand either the direction that the muscle is moving, or the orientation of the muscle, or it may tell you where the muscle is located, or it may tell you what the muscle does. So let's go through some of these. I'll just kind of pronounce them for you, but you'll need to kind of memorize them, and you're going to see them. You're going to see them over and over as we learn the names of the muscles. So if the name of the muscle has anterior, obviously that means it's in the front. You already know that term. Externus is going to be a muscle that is superficial. And often then there are two muscles, and maybe one of them is externus and one of them is internus. So you may have two muscles with the same name, but one is externus and one is internus, because one is superficial and one is more deep or internal. Same idea with extrinsic and intrinsic. Inferioris and superioris, we're going to see that when we get to the muscles around the mouth and the lips. You're going to have some of the same muscles, but they're going to have superioris or inferioris attached to the name to help you know which one is elevating the lip and which one is maybe which one is elevating the top lip and which one is depressing the lower lip, for example. Lateralis and medialis or medius, that's going to tell you the muscle is lateral or medial. Oblique will tell you the angle that the muscle is running. Posterior will mean it's behind something or towards the back. Profundus will mean it's deep. That's probably a new word for you to learn. Rectus means it's straight, like the muscles of the abdomen that give you your six-pack Those are abdominis rectus muscles. Superficialis, you could probably figure out, means it's superficial or on the surface. Transversus, you could probably also figure out, means it's transverse or perpendicular to the long axis of the body or the limb. Here are some terms that indicate the region of the body. I'll just kind of go through and read them, and you can look and memorize which parts of the body they talk about. Abdominis, anconeus, auricularis, brachialis, which I already mentioned, biceps brachii, capitis, carpi. You'll see that a lot of the muscles of the forearm have the term carpi in them. Cervicis, clido or clavius, coccygeus, costalis, cutaneous, femoris, genio, glosso or glossal, halicis, ilio, inguinal, lumborum, nasalis, nuchal, oculo, oris, palpebrae, pollicis, popliteus, psoas, radialis, scapularis, temporalis, thoracis, tibialis, ulnaris, and euro. Some of these terms will probably be familiar to you. For example, biceps we've talked about. That means it has 2 points of origin. Triceps means 3. And quadriceps, which is, if you've probably called your anterior thigh muscles your quads, that's because there are actually 4 origins to actually 4 different muscles there. And so we often call that the quadriceps. Then there are some terms that refer to the shape of the muscle. So deltoid, the ones that are just above your shoulder, just on top of your shoulder, and off laterally, those are called the deltoids, and they're kind of triangular in shape. Orbicularis, we're going to see, is circular. Pectinate, piriformis, platis means flat, and we'll have a platysma muscle in your neck. Pyramidal, rhomboideus, serratus, splenius, teres, trapezius, and we're going to learn several muscles that have those terms in it. Then there are some other words. A lot of these come from Latin that just give a little extra identification to the muscle. And they're important because if you understand what they mean, then it's going to help you remember where they are or what they do or what's unique about them. So understanding these terms will help you hopefully remember where those muscles are and what kind of movement those muscles make. So alba is white, brevis is short. So you're going to have brevis versus longus, gracilis, lata, latissimus, longismus or longismus. Mostly you'll probably see longismus. Magnus, major, maximus, minimus, minor, tendinosus, and vastus. Some terms will tell you the action that muscle produces. So if it's an adductor or an abductor, it tells you it's going to move it towards the midline or away from the midline. Depressor is going to move something down. Extensor or flexor will change the angle of a joint. Levator will kind of be the opposite of depressor. It's going to elevate something. Pronator, rotator, supinator, tensor. Pronator is going to cause pronation. Rotator is always going to cause rotation, like the muscles of the rotator cuff. Supinator is going to be something that's going to move the shoulder up, for example. And then we have very specific ones. These ones are probably less helpful, but maybe interesting to learn. Buccinator muscle is the cheek muscle that we'll learn, which means trumpeter. Risorius is another muscle that kind of helps bring your lips out when you smile. So that came from the word laugher. And sartorius, like a tailor. The last thing I want to discuss in this introduction lecture to muscle is the idea of muscles as levers or levers, depending on how you want to pronounce it. And I guess the muscles are levers, but it's really the muscles and the bones together that are producing the lever. You can kind of think of the muscle more as the man who's applying the force. You can think of the bone really as the lever. And we're going to talk about that fixed point. The fulcrum is going to be the joint. And then, of course, you've got some kind of a load, whether you're carrying a gallon of milk or whether you're bench pressing or you're walking, there's a load that has to be moved or lifted, and that's going to be on the other end of the fulcrum of the joint. So there's different kinds of fulcrums, and we're not going to go into the details of all of those, so you don't really have to know this is a third-class lever. I just thought it helped illustrate what I'm saying well. So if you look at the, in this case, the fulcrum is the joint, we said in the previous slide. So the fulcrum is going to be the elbow joint. And in this type of lever, you actually have the applied force and the load on the same side of the lever, but in opposite directions. So because the biceps brachii muscle attaches right here distal to the elbow joint, you're going to see that the applied force is just distal to the fulcrum. And because whatever we're lifting, maybe it's a bag of groceries he's got here, you know, maybe there's some canned corn and maybe there's some, you know, chocolate creamer or something. And so he's got to lift this bag, that's the load, and the load is pulling down, right? Gravity is pulling down on that. And the biceps brachii is contracting in the opposite direction to help lift that fulcrum, which is the bone. And then that will hopefully help lift that load of the grocery bag. So this is how muscles work with joints and bones to produce a lever system that makes it easier for us to lift things. Sometimes muscles also act as pulleys, and often it's some kind of a tendon or an extension of the muscle that's acting like a pulley. Remember, pulleys are typically, when we think of a pulley mechanically, you're thinking of usually pulling a rope through a pulley to kind of help pull in one direction, but it lifts an object in a different direction. And so that's kind of what pulleys are doing in the human body. So let's say, for example, if we're looking here at the ankle, and we'll see again in a minute in the knee, let's say we want to move the foot in that direction, but we want to use this muscle. Well, this muscle can only apply force in those directions, right? It's a parallel muscle, and it's only going to contract. And so all it could ever really do, if it attached here, is kind of move that up, which is not what we want. We want to move the foot up. We want to get, maybe we want some dorsiflexion of the ankle. So the way that the body kind of gets around that anatomically is to make a pulley out of the tendon. And so in this case, the lateral malleolus, which is a part of the, oh, well, you guys have learned this already, a part of the fibula, acts as the pulley. And the tendon then goes around the pulley, acting as the rope, and is able to attach, let's say, here to the foot, so that when the muscle contracts in this direction, because of the pulley, it ends up pulling the foot in this direction because of the insertion point. And so you're able to change the direction of force by using the bone, part of the bone, as a pulley. And we'll start also in the knee. This is kind of super important. Here's the quadriceps femoris on the thigh muscle. And when it contracts, right, if it was attached here to the patella, all it could do is move the patella back, and that would not get your foot to lift. In order to get your foot to lift, you need to apply a force in this direction. Without the pulley system, the quadriceps only pulls in that direction, so you wouldn't be able to get lift of the tibia or lift of the lower leg. So the way your body does that is it gets around that is it uses the patella as a pulley. So the patella becomes the pulley, and the quadriceps tendon goes right around, even through that patella. It attaches on either side. so that when the quadriceps contracts in this direction, because the tendon has changed directions because of the patella acting as a pulley, it's able then to cause a force in this direction, which lifts the leg. In fact, I ruptured this part of the tendon on this leg playing basketball. I think I maybe have told you this story before. And because I ruptured that, I cut that. Whenever I contracted my quadriceps, I was not able to actually move my leg. I could not lift my knee joint. I could not extend my knee joint at all, no matter how hard I tried, because that pulley system had been broken. And all I could do was move the patella back, but because the patella was no longer attached to the tibia, it had no effect on extending my leg. So this is how your body uses levers and pulleys by a kind of a really clever use of muscle, tendon, and parts of bones.